Today we've got Francesco from Sainthood Reps. Super excited to chat with you. This is a band that honestly, even though Cullen and I grew up as Tooth and Nail kids, because I think that first album came out, 2012, 2013, that was kind of in that era where we were kind of like going to college. We're starting to experiment more with other music. We're kind of leaving that Tooth and Nail vein. So I'll be honest, I sort of missed you guys, but I recognize the name. Like I remember y'all getting signed during that time. But anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say here is Cullen and I are huge Tooth and Nail fans, and I feel like we know probably most Tooth and Nail bands pretty like inside and out. But I'll be honest, I think Sainthood Reps is one of those Tooth and Nail bands, or a band that was on Tooth and Nail at some point, that I don't actually know that much about. So it feels like an honor that I get to like learn more about Tooth and Nail history.
Yeah, it's awesome. And you're not alone. There's a lot of people who missed out on Sainthood Reps. I can tell you that firsthand. Over the last 15 years or so, we've always kind of gotten that moniker of like, the band that like your favorite band's favorite band kind of thing. Where it's
the band's band. I've heard the Appleseed Cast being described that way before.
Oh, they're up there. Color Revolts is another band that's up there, where it's a lot of these bands that like, you trace their lineage back to, their influences, and it's like, oh, well, this band is kind of doing all of that. So we definitely had that going for us. But yeah, if you're by far not the only ones who missed the Sainthood Reps boat when we were on Tooth and Nail.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll dive more into that at some point, but let's get into the history of Sainthood Reps. And I guess maybe before we really dive into like the actual band history, I'd love to just hear like how you got into music. That's always interesting to me, is, just how people get into music that eventually become, professional musicians themselves. Like what's that origin story?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's not a time in my life where I can remember not being completely infatuated and in love with music. I don't mind dating myself. I'm 39 years old. I grew up watching MTV. I grew up watching Beavis and Butthead. I grew up watching, I was like a total metalhead. I remember watching Neil Young play with Pearl Jam on, I think it was the Video Music Awards, or it might have been the Movie Awards. I forget which one it was. And seeing Neil Young's old Blackie, I think he calls it, his guitar, his like signature black Les Paul that he uses, and just I was always fascinated with instruments. Like I would look at, the Blind Melon video for No Rain. Even to this day, I still want like a banana yellow Strat that the guitarist was using in that, or like looking at Lars Ulrich's drum set in the One video or something. So I always just loved the idea of like getting behind an instrument and playing it. And then one day, like, there was a family that was living in an apartment in the same house as us. And they introduced me to the Black Album from Metallica. And basically ever since then, it was over. It was just, I'm not going to do anything else besides music. I am in love with music. I want to play drums. I joined like the school band when I was a little kid. Because it was the cheapest instrument. My parents were like, no, we're not paying $300 for a sax. Like, you want to play violin? Like, no. But a pair of drumsticks and a little practice pad, that was like $15 from Musicland in Lindenhurst, Lindenhurst, Long Island, which is where I grew up. So it was a very easy like conduit for me to get into music. And since then, just always in love with it, like playing all different, I eventually branched out from Metallica. I deprogrammed the Lars Ulrich from myself and, branched out into other influences as well. And then from there, just in high school, Long Island was just such a like seismically active area for just all of this music growing up. The bands just kind of like speak for themselves. Where I grew up, they had just all these influential hardcore bands like Silent Majority and Inside and Mind Over Matter and Trick Face, and then the emo explosion happens when I'm like early in high school with the Brand News and Taking Back Sundays and Glassjaws and all that stuff. So it was just like almost inescapable, this idea of playing music and then getting into a band. If you were from Lindenhurst, even if you were like a jock, like football player, or you're like an artsy kid or somewhere in between, everybody was kind of like going to shows, and everybody was really into, like, if you walk down Lindenhurst High School in the early 2000s and just pulled any kid aside and said like, what's your favorite Save the Day song? Everybody was listening to Save the Day. Everyone was listening to Thursday and all these like huge emo bands. So it was just natural, like growing up playing percussion in my school band to playing in rock bands with my friends and going to shows. It was just ingrained in the culture of Lindenhurst. And that's kind of what eventually led me to Sainthood Reps, playing with Derek, who's our, other guitarist and other lead singer, songwriter. He has a much more active role in singing on this record. So that's kind of how
Cool.
we became friends. And yeah, that's sort of the origin.
That's fun.
I
There
just like
must
can't imagine
be.
what that experience would have been like where everybody listens to the same music as you,
Yeah,
because that was not the case for Cullen and I at all.
yeah, definitely not.
Yeah, I always hear that from people, and it really is a special, like a special time, and it's a big reason why there are just so many Long Island bands that came out around that time, and it's just so synonymous with that early 2000s emo scene, is just because it was so pervasive. I mean, everyone,
Hmm.
and that's not to say that there weren't like cliques in high school. That's not to say I wasn't made fun of because I was in marching band, like, because that definitely happened. But for the most part, it was a lot more like, and even to this day, like a lot of people who still hung around, like it was just part of the culture over there.
Yeah, that's such a cool thing, and I feel like that time period was very accepting of that kind of thing. Maybe not entirely, obviously, but there was a moment in time where it was kind of accepted that you listened to music that was considered alternative by your parents and everything like that, but to you and your buddies, it was, and even to kind of like the zeitgeist of people your age, it was commonly accepted, right?
I think it just the overlap of, because a lot of those bands, like the earlier hardcore bands were very much singing about, like, their message was a lot more like it was either being part of like a crew, or being anti-crew, or being like outcasts, or being kind of left out. Whereas like then when the late 90s and early 2000s emo scene came on, it was sort of about being outcast, but it was also about like everyday suburbia. And I think that's why a lot of
Yeah,
kids latched onto it, is because it's like the average suburban kid can then identify with it. They're like, oh, this isn't just about like getting beat up at a show, or not wanting to get beat up at a show, or like it's not about these hardcore principles. It's about like just everyday things that happen. It's about relationships, for better or for worse. Like there's a lot of shittiness that
yeah,
happened with that too, but it was much more relatable for like the average kid. I think that's why it really blew up. And being from the Northeast, like that was definitely one of the hotbeds for it. So I think that's why it was a little bit
yeah.
more pervasive than like other styles of music.
Yeah, I've got like a little theory or maybe a coined term where I call it like a soft rebellion, especially
Yeah.
with that emo music, right? That emo music of the 90s and early 2000s is very much a soft rebellion. It wasn't something that was going to completely like alienate you from your parents and from the rest of society, but it was definitely something that was speaking to you as an individual in a completely different way than any of the other music that was out there.
Of course, yeah. Like in the early mid 90s, if you went to a show, like even emo bands, like if you're going to like a Rites of Spring show or something, like they're still like slam dancing. There's still, kids going
Totally.
crazy. Whereas like that was still the case, but then it's like kind of what you're saying, Colin. Like there's also dashboard You can go to a VFW and see dashboard. You can see a guy with an acoustic guitar, and it's like, wow, that's way different. And it's it speaks to like how much more diverse it was becoming, but at the same time, once it became commoditized, where it's like it is very much like emo suburbia. Like then it started to be more exclusive, whereas like growing up before that, shows used to be really diverse. You used to see ska bands playing with hardcore
Yeah.
bands, playing with like everything in between, weird electronic stuff. There's a band called World Inferno Friendship Society that I saw, that they would light their cymbals on fire, and like at like just a bar
Yeah.
somewhere. And
That's
you
some
it,
Blue
would-
Man Group type shit.
yeah, like nothing was out of place. But then by that point, it was just like you're in an emo band, and if you're not in an emo band, like get the fuck out. Like kids didn't want to hear it, so it did lead to like a sort of like elitism in the scene. Like anytime a
Mm.
scene is like grows and blows up that fast, where it becomes more accessible. You do have a lot of people who are like, you have the snobs, but you also have people that are like, not as accepting to alternative types of music. So that was like one of the downsides of it, I think.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Well, coming back to you and some of the influences that you listed there, there's one that I think maybe I have a sneaking suspicion might have been in there that you didn't list. And I think it might be something like Jerry Cantrell, especially in those early albums, man. They have a very Jerry Cantrell-esque vibe, at least to my ears. Is that something you would say as well?
100%. So it kind of ties into what I was just like talking about in the origins of Sainthood. So like we all grew up in, the emo scene, and we all wanted to like, at some point, we just wanted to do something different. We wanted to like, and by like the late 2000s, there's a lot of other things going on, but like we really wanted to lean into like our 90s influences. Like I mentioned, I grew up on Alice in Chains too. I remember seeing the Men in the Box video and how creepy it was and the nightmares that it gave me as a kid with the eyes sewn shut. But it was still like once we leaned into it, like when we started, when Sainthood formed and with the first record, we were like, this is exactly like we ripped off Alice in Chains so much. Like on the new record, there's a song where I straight up just ripped off Alice in Chains. Like I think I just kind of took Them Bones and made it a little bit less. Them Bones is in like 7. It's a weird time signature.
It's a weird time signature, yeah.
I made it much more straightforward. It's not Alice in Chains, but it's like the harmonies that are there. Like that's where I really like. As I've grown up, I've always loved Alice in Chains and the harmonies, but as I've gotten older, just appreciating them so much more and just how much like. Lane Staley is the one that gets like all the credit, but Jerry Cantrell is like the engine of the band. But even like Mike Starr and the drummer whose name I forget on my social media, it's just
not Sam Kinney. Wait, is it? No, something Kinney. Sean Kinney.
Sean Kinney. That's right.
Yeah.
The intro to No Excuses, like I just see all over social media, like drummers covering that and stuff. So the early '90s grunge is such an obvious like influence for us, but at that time, it's just not a lot. When we were like starting to put Sainthood together and start writing Monoculture in like 2008, 9, it really wasn't something that a lot of bands were doing. They were still kind of in the emo phase, and they were still like, whatever. We were like, let's just really lean into it, but let's get even weirder. Let's throw in Young Widows. Let's throw in Jesus Lizard. Let's throw in like all those like like early like Shellac or just let's throw those in. But also like if you want to throw in a Tom Petty sounding song, like let's do it. We didn't want any restrictions. We kind of just went with like we have all these different influences, let's try to make it work. And sometimes it worked really well and sometimes it didn't, but that's kind of where like Tooth and Nail really latched onto us. Like we played in 2011, we played South by Southwest showcase with them, and there was a bunch of bands. I think the Almost played. I don't remember all the bands that played, but the owner of Tooth and Nail, Brandon Ebel, went up to us and he's like, "You guys sound exactly like Bark Market," and I'm like, I was like, that's what a pull. Yeah, that's from Tooth and Nail. I'm like, wow, that really is like a pull, and that's something that they loved about us is that it was kind of a throwback to when Tooth and Nail first started. Like, there is like all those bands, like Me Without You is the obvious comparison, but like Starflyer 59 or, bands like that where there's like, oh, we want to kind of like bring a band on that's going to call back to like the Tooth and Nail roots and stuff. So that's really like, when you mentioned Jerry Cantrell, that's in like the wheelhouse, but all the Soundgardens and the Pearl Jams and Nirvanas, like that's, that was such a huge influence for us. And it was, again, not saying that like, listen, like we're really breaking ground here, guys. Like we're talking this, there's this band called Nirvana. I don't know if you ever heard of them, but like, we're really influenced, but like not saying that, but to incorporate that into the styles that we did was, that was like the whole point of the band.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was essentially like that genre of music, that grunge-esque style of music was almost completely dead at that point. And the fact that you were able to meld some of those sounds and those harmonies especially into music that has post-hardcore elements and punk elements. And I mean, it's literally a smattering of a little bit of everything. Just like you said, it really is something special. And Mason and I, we haven't had a chance to talk about this yet, but like we were actually kicking ourselves a little bit about like how did we kind of miss the boat on you guys?
Well, I think a lot of it was also like because we were, a little bit on the eclectic side, I think, it was really tough to find like what our niche was. It's like, all right, well, at the time, like we're not going to fit in with hardcore bands. We're a little bit too melodic or a little bit too out there for those bands. We're not an emo band, like we're not definitely not, we're not too heavy for indie, not heavy enough for hardcore, not heavy enough for screamo, whatever. So it was really tough to find like that natural fit for us. And eventually we started just sort of gravitating towards bands like Oh Brother was a band that we were very close with, and Me Without You, and Law Dispute, Balancing and Poetry. We kind of like once those bands started to emerge, where they were also kind of starting to incorporate elements of grunge into what they were doing, it sort of started to make a little bit more sense about where we should fit in. But in those like early years, and that was something that I always loved about our band. But that's why, like, I kind of jokingly said, like, a lot of people miss the boat is because we didn't really have a scene. And the ones that we did belong to, we were kind of outliers in that scene, which was always really cool. I always appreciate bands that are sort of those outliers that are like, bringing something a little bit different to the table. But I
Yeah.
think that's kind of why I guess we kind of like flew under the radar for at least like in those early years. And then, once we started touring more and, started to work towards our second record, we were more cognizant of like, all right, let's maybe like be a little bit more focused and like try to be like a little more cohesive, maybe not be as like esoteric with what we're trying to bring into the fold when it comes to our styles and our influences.
For sure.
Yeah, and I also think there's like a piece of this too where Tooth and Nail was entering into a new part of its history
100%.
where, Tooth and Nail obviously started out very indie. And then once obviously they got more popular, I think they got bought out by EMI.
Yeah.
And then if I remember right, it's around the time that you guys get signed that Tooth and Nail buys back their catalog and becomes independent again. And I remember around that time you started to hear at least the bands that Tooth and Nail was starting to sign again around that 2013 post 2013 timeframe are bands that definitely kind of had this more indie sound that they would have had at the beginning years, because in especially maybe like mid 2000s to that early 2010s, because of the fact that they're owned by this big corporation, they definitely were moving towards a very much more poppier sound. And
Oh
you see
yeah.
that with a lot of the bands and artists that they were signing at that time. But yeah, it was around the time that you guys get signed is around the time that Tooth and Nail becomes independent again. And so just from like the history of the label itself, it's probably this kind of time period where there's transition. And whenever there's going to be transition, they might not necessarily have like the bandwidth or the know-how of like, how do we market indie bands again, or bands that would kind of be in the indie vein like your guys' band was.
Yeah, I think there was with Tooth and Nail, there was an element. Listen, it's a business at the end of the day, so I don't think it was totally this, but I do think there was an element of like it's sort of a passion project for them too. It was just like we were bringing something that like really harkened back to like the old days. Like when we played like a lot of and thinking back to some of the contemporaries. I remember when we were signed to Tooth and Nail, we were just kind of like looking through the internet and seeing like on this is like 2011, so various like message boards and through social media and stuff. And I remember coming across, and I don't remember the name of the band, but it made me laugh really hard. On like some discussion board somewhere, someone from some band was like, I can't believe Sainthood Reps signed with Tooth and Nail. They're the best band on Tooth and Nail. And I'm speaking as somebody who is on Tooth and Nail right now. And it's like people on the label. So we had that like cred, and we also like when we played live, like, our contemporaries were very polished and we were very not. Like that was kind of our thing was like, we're going to make a lot of noise. We're going to jump around. We're going to like throw our guitars around. Like, yeah, we're not going to be like complete idiots on stage, but at the same time, like, the performance aspect of it is very much like angular and dissonant. And that's what was kind of the charm, but it was just, yeah, maybe not like the exact right time for that. But also, yeah, it was definitely at a time where, like, yes, like we do have some, more polished songs, some more like, indie sounding songs. But I think, yeah, it was just a case of like all right, is this band like just are they, a Shellac ripoff band? Are they like an Alice in Chains ripoff? Are they Young Widows ripoff? Are they, Balancing Composure ripoff? Like what are they? And if the answer is kind of like all of it, I guess. I always think that, we kind of are wear our influences on our sleeve. But yeah, I think it was at a time where it was definitely a transitional period for Tooth and Nail, and there's not really like a ton of alignment of like, all right, how to best handle this, but that's just kind of like how it goes. It's especially around that time, music is a very momentum driven business, and if you don't have momentum on your side, it is really hard to build that back up until there's something else to really kind of bring it back. So I think that's kind of like what happened in the Tooth and Nail days. But it was awesome. We had there's some of the most fun times of our band was during those
Hell
days. It was
yeah.
great. Yeah.
So, talk a little bit again more about this relationship with Tooth and Nail, where obviously you guys have the first album with them, and then I think the second album wasn't with them, correct?
It
So,
was
yeah, what was the like? It sounds like you certainly were appreciative of your time with Tooth and Nail. So, like, what was sort of that sort of transition out of Tooth and Nail like into that second album?
Yeah, I think everyone was kind of, very much on the same page. We, given the like we love the record, we loved our time with them, but just where the band was going didn't seem like the best fit for us. We were starting to gain some momentum with like, bands like Balancing Composure, like La Dispute, like Tiger's Jaw, like that scene. So we eventually signed with No Sleep Records. No Sleep had always they've been fans of us like for a while at that point, and it just seemed like a really great fit. We always wanted to record with Will Yip, and Will Yip had a great relationship with No Sleep. He was doing a lot of bands for them at the time. So basically, like how our band was being driven and the direction that we were taking with the second record, we were just like, this is definitely the direction that we want to go in. It's a better fit in terms of like tours that we find ourselves on, the audience that's sort of gravitating towards us. So when we went with No Sleep, it was very much driven by, where the audience was going, where our band seemed to be going at the time, like really leaning into more of like the grungier emo aspects of what we did and less into like the noisier parts of what we did. And it was also driven by, like we've just always dreamt of recording with Will Yip, but we also record with Mike Sapone. So we decided to split the record where we do the drums and bass with Will Yip and then the guitars and vocals with Mike Sapone, and he would produce it. So yeah, it just from, where we were going at the time, it just really made the most sense for us at that point. And yeah, like it's just the natural way of how bands like kind of work is like, all right, we see where things are going, we see why it's not working with Tooth and Nail or what we could do differently. And yeah, we still, still talk with Tooth and Nail, still love No Sleep, still love all those. It's just, it really is such a privilege to be able to have like, put out records on legendary labels like that, so that's another thing that we kind of always wanted to do too, is like, we didn't want to have our toes in like one pool and that's it. We wanted to really like we wanted to tour with a lot of different bands and put out splits with bands that you might not have associated with us. Like Weatherbox is a good example. Like we put out a split with them. It's like not two bands that you would necessarily like put together. So it just kind of fits the trajectory of the band of always kind of wanting to do something different and always kind of wanting to like move forward in a way.
Yeah, what you're kind of describing, and you were alluding to this, is you sort of are like this band where you're so versatile it almost becomes like a detriment, where there's just so many different great sounds that are going on and like kind of different genres that you're combining, that it becomes this thing where it's like, where exactly do we put you? Like it's like where do you belong exactly? But like you mentioned before too, like from your own reflection of your band, like that's a part of the band that you actually really like, even though if that's not from a maybe like a marketing standpoint, it's a thing that like is all that marketable. But I'll
Yeah, for
like I'll speak
sure.
for both I'll speak for both Cullen and I. Like, we both are like, that's the kind of band that we're into. Like, you know, a lot of the bands that you have been maybe associated with, or even a lot of the bands that you all have been influenced by, are many of our favorite bands as well. And so whenever we see a band that like both is considered post-hardcore and post-rock, like, sign me up.
Yeah.
I'm all about a band like that. And again, I'll speak for Cullen too. Like, that's definitely a band that like he's immediately, and that's why, like, especially the fact that you guys were associated with Tooth and Nail and were described in that way, it like throws me off. That I'm like, oh my God, like that's exactly the kind of band Cullen and I would have totally gravitated towards, especially the fact that you all were on Tooth and Nail. So it's
Yeah.
like one of those things where I just can't believe we missed you at the time, especially when you all were on Tooth and Nail.
I'm glad you brought up post rock because that's the origins of like Sainthood, is that me and Derek loved Mogwai and Explosions in the Sky. Those are two bands that were two of our favorite bands, and two bands that we really bonded over. And we initially decided we're going to be a post rock band. We're going to play instrumental. Like, we just want to do that. And that's why the first tour we ever did, well, sort of the first tour we ever did, we did 5 days ish. I forget. It was like a week with a band called All the Day Holiday. And then right after that, we are basically like just got in the van and toured with Caspian. And to this day, our bassist Yanni is playing bass in Caspian right now. Brad, our drummer, is their front of house and their tour manager. You know, so they're a band that we've had a very, very close relationship with for, wow, like over 15 years at this point. But those are kind of the roots of, like, I think that we always wanted to kind of have this through line of post rock in what we did as well. And a lot of our early shows, we had like a couple of songs where it was just instrumental. We've always just really loved that dynamic of building from something quiet to something really loud and everything in between. And the roots and the influences of post rock, especially like some of the more heavier post rock bands, I think are really apparent in the early days as well. But we also realized like that's not really, it's a very hard like genre to kind of break into unless there's no halfway post rock bands. Like, you're either a post rock band or you're not. Like, you know, Caspian is a great example of this, and they've done a great job of branching out and touring with other bands like Appleseed Cast, you mentioned before, they toured with them. But like, if you're a post rock band, you're getting put on post rock shows. You're getting put on shows where there's no vocalists. And that's kind of how like myopic a lot of these scenes are. And it's not just on them. It's like, you know, promoters think like, oh, fans of post rock only like post rock. They want to hear four of the same sounding bands. And that's kind of where, like, you know, we always did well to stand out in tours and stuff because we always had a different sound. But again, like Mason, what you said, like, I think it's hard to like really market. It's hard to find that like niche of, you know, which is like also, I think, a reason why we've kind of stuck together for so long is because it's always interesting and it's always fun. It's never just like, all right, let's go back and rewrite the same record and hope this one lands. It's like, no, like, fuck it, we're just gonna do what we feel like, and the new record has so much of that too. So
Yeah. Well, and I know we talked about this, you know, sort of like being the band's band, and I don't bring them up just because they were also on Tooth and Nail, but I know you mentioned them a little bit before, and I don't compare you guys to Me Without You because I think you sound like Me Without You. In fact, I think you actually sound quite different in a lot of ways from Me Without You. But the reason why I bring them up, though, is Me Without You feels like one of those bands, especially a band that was associated with Tooth and Nail, that could have been so much bigger given the influence that they have in the music scene. Like, they're one of those
oh
bands
yeah.
where like you talk about, you talk to lots of like super popular artists that were really influenced by Me Without You, and you'd think they're way bigger than they actually ever were. But they were one of those bands that like you couldn't really like, especially early on, they were like pretty post-hardcore punk, even like pretty hardcore punk, and then they like go into this like indie phase, and then they go into this
Yeah.
folky phase, and then they kind of go
Yeah.
back into this indie, like, so they were always a band that's like, how, and again, like, I think from the Tooth and Nail standpoint, like, where do we market this band, like, how do we market? And regardless of the marketing ability of the band, like, at the end of the day, they were a band that clearly became very influential especially to a lot of other bands and artists.
Yeah. And I just think when you're an authentic band, that's going to come across. Me Without You is such an authentic band. There is no pretense with them at all. They're equal parts like intense and visceral, but they're also like so whimsical. Like there is no other band like them. They
Yeah.
are a one. They're a one and only. And I think they also like really grounded out for a long time too. I think they caught on pretty early, and I think that helps to sustain a lot of bands when they can capture some like really early success. But it afforded them the ability to be more experimental, kind of going forward, which is something that we always like really admired with them. And we were fortunate enough to play with them many times. But they're just, yeah, like they were in so many ways, like, yeah, maybe not like a one-to-one comparison of like sound. There was not a lot of times where like I know me personally, like writing songs, I'm not really calling to like what their style, but just more like their approach to artistry. Like I'll give you a good example. Like when they would write out their set list, they would do a different set list every night, and even their set lists were art. Like they would draw pictures of each song title, and they would be like really colorful. And they tore it out of a bus that ran on vegetable oil, and they
Right.
were just like the way that they were always kind of like you know putting a different angle on everything and not fitting into one box. That was always kind of what I took from it. But yeah, they were just a real like one and only band, and I think that's why a lot of people really gravitated towards them because they did have, like I said, I think they had the post-hardcore early on. I think that was enough to like get people to latch on, but also just incredibly smart, and Aaron's lyrics are just
Right.
otherworldly. But yeah, like I think a lot of bands, like they're a band that are very difficult to try and replicate, but also at the same time they're a band that's very easy to be influenced by.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and speaking of, we have some pretty interesting writing on the new album on Dull Bliss. Now, I've only heard a couple songs, but it sounds like you have a little bit of a concept going on with the new one, Dull Bliss. I love the title, by the way, and I think
Yeah.
that it's definitely leading listeners into a certain state of mind. Would you care to kind of explain where this new album is going and what they should expect and why they should listen?
They should listen because it's fucking awesome.
Hell yeah, brother.
Do you remember where it
Uh,
kind of cut out at, Cullen?
I was talking about Derek's songs
You were
are
talking
more
about the concept
mellow.
of Dull Bliss. Yep. That's
So
where we're at.
Yeah.
Dull Bliss is basically like, all right, so when Derek was writing his songs and I was writing mine, we kind of realized like Derek's songs are more on the melodic side. They're more, like they're a little bit longer, more introspective, whereas mine were kind of like shorter and heavier. So it really is this kind of like, juxtaposition of two different styles. It's like our own shitty version of like Love Below and Speaker Box, right? Like, but we got to work with someone that we wanted to work with forever. We were working with our good friend Brett Romness, who we call him Rat, and he plays drums in I'm the Avalanche and Crime and Stereo and The Movie Light, but he also produces tons and tons and tons of bands. He just recently produced and engineered for Anxious. He produced for Hot Mulligan and engineers for them, and just whole bunch of, including all the bands that he plays in. So just working with him, like that was another reason. Like we always like we look at that side too. Is like we want to work with engineers and producers. Like yes, we want to write our own songs, but we want to kind of like work with the people behind the scenes as well. We love working with designers and people, to create merch for us. It's just the real collaborative spirit of that. So Dull Bliss kind of came together as like, I had a song called Dull, and the rest of the band was really adamant that I included it's an acoustic song, and I was like really not sure if I wanted it on the record. I'm like, I don't know if it really fits. It's really like Elliott Smith sounding song. Like it's great, but I'm just not sure if it's a Sainthood song. But they were very adamant to include it on the record. And then, when we're trying to come up with like names for the record, we're like, Dull is a great name for the record. There's a lot of the lyrics kind of revolve around that. And this idea, I had another song called Bliss. That was like a recurring theme that we were kind of toying with. So I was like, yeah, all right, yeah, like dull bliss, that makes total sense. Because a lot of the lyrics just kind of revolve around that idea of like either, you kind of just either trying to dull yourself to get through the day, or you're looking for bliss or just somewhere in between. And it could either be like, one and the same, right? Like it could be if, for people who are into drugs, like drugs are the definition of dull bliss, right? Like, but it's also about, relationships and just how relationships could fall apart, or the struggle to keep relationships that can turn into sort of like a dull bliss. So it's this idea like bliss doesn't always have to be this concept of like, you're just in complete elation and you're just floating about. It could just be like you're kind of just going about your day, just, or in this sort of like malaise, but you're also like just too afraid to kind of go for it, I guess. But that's kind of like where, there, just like the juxtaposition. But the reason why I said before why it's like the culmination, right? It just kind of brought everything together before, where it was like on earlier releases, it's like, oh, this is the Jesus Lizard song, or this is the Balancing Approach song. Now it's kind of like
Sure.
all of our songs are like, definitively us, I guess, in a way, like where it doesn't really sound like, it just sounds like a band that has really kind of found their own voice, and
Mm.
like not really focused so much on the influences, but more just like, all right, this is like where we are, and this is, the trajectory is like kind of the same. It's just the path to get there may have taken a little bit longer, but yeah, it's like
Yeah.
really, really excited about it. It's gonna be really, really great.
I love that idea of like self-actualization, right?
Yeah.
You look at like some of like the greatest bands from history, and you know which record is their self-actualized record every time. I mean, if you look at the Beatles, right? They make a lot of like not bubblegum pop, but like pop music that's definitely aimed at like teenage girls first and foremost, right? And then they come out with Rubber Soul, and it all of a sudden it's self-actualized and it's introspective, and it's more their unique voice instead of them trying to be something else or taking bits and pieces from something else. The Pink Floyd has the same trajectory. It doesn't matter what band you're talking about. I mean, Under Oath has that trajectory almost to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So I think that there is a lot of wonderful maturity that comes with that is very easily expressed and understood in the music by the listener. And I think this is going to be one of those records that is going to absolutely nail that to the floor.
I think this is a record that anybody who was into us, like it's like anybody who's into the first two records are going to love, and people who may not have caught on to the first, I think it's a great introduction into, in a lot of ways, like the first two records are, I don't want to say more complex because this is very, very complex, but it is more of a ride, I would say, like the first two records. This one is much more like focused, and there's a very natural progression, and kind of like Colin, what you're saying about like, to use the Beatles as an example, like, yeah, like Rubber Soul comes out, but there's little nuggets that happen on Help and before that where you can see like the seed kind of growing into something. And I think when people hear Dull Bliss, and if they're familiar with monoculture and like the, and Headswell and, the music that we put out in the interim, I think you'll hear kind of like the inklings of where this was going. And this is kind of like the amalgamation of all that into like something that's fully realized. So it's, I can tell you right now, definitely like the best that we've ever felt about a record, being put out. It's also just really reflective of where we are in our personal lives and as musicians, and kind of incorporating everything that we've learned as people. It's just really exciting to put this out. It was never really a question of whether we're going to put out another record after Headswell. Was just a matter of when. So
yeah. Well, why so long? Can we ask that?
Sure, yeah. So after Headswell, we kind of decided like, all right, let's take a break from this for a little bit. Things weren't really going as we had hoped that they were going. It's just the trials and tribulations of being in a band. It's hard, like, being away from family, being away from loved ones, and unless like even for bands that are crushing it, it's really hard. So under the best of circumstances, it's tough. So if you're a band that's not really kind of kicking on like we were, we had some good things going for us, but we all kind of agreed as we were getting older, like, yeah, it's not really going where we want it to. So, we took a step back for a couple of years. Like I decided like, yeah, I'm going to go to school. Whereas the other Brad and Yanni decided that they're going to like, pursue other projects. Derek has, pursued other projects as well, running a business. So we decided to like really take a step back and let life kind of, dictate where we want to go. And after like a year or 2 years, like people were asking us to do shows with them, asking us to do tours still. And like, we kind of realized like there's still a lot of interest in this band and we all still like each other. So why not? Let's just keep playing. And then let's just see how we could fit it into our lives. And then, in 2017, 18, we decided to just like, let's put out a couple of songs, right? Just see what happens. And then that happens. And then, decide to stay active and start thinking about like, all right, maybe we can like start writing a record. But, so COVID happens. So that like shifts everything around. But we always just kind of decided like, all right, we understand that, we're not actively touring right now. So that's going to delay the amount of time. But it also gave us a lot of time to really kind of hone in on what we want to do and how we want to present ourselves as a band. I think if we had put out a record like 5 years ago or so, it would be a very different record than what we have right now. So yeah, obviously like a lot of the delays, there's like logistics delays and all that stuff, but essentially why we decided to give it some time to breathe is just to pursue other things. And I think it really was the best thing for us. It allowed us to really kind of like not worry about like, all right, what scene does this belong in? Or like what label or what, like we just went in with, all right, we have good songs. I like this song. Let's record it. I don't like that song. Fuck it. I don't, let's not use that one. It was just very, very laid back and it just made it so much more enjoyable to be in a band with these guys again, and I think the time apart and to do other things really helped us shape the record to where it is.
Did even like some of the other projects that like the other guys were working on, or even maybe like your own kind of exploration with music, were like there new sounds or even like new bands that you had encountered where you're like, oh, I kind of want to like see what that would be like for Sainthood Reps? Like what was there? Yeah, was there some sort of kind of new influence just from like a sound standpoint that you were like, oh, that adds like that could add, or like that could like get us to that point of like whatever we think that the Sainthood Reps sound is, like that gets us there. Like were there new bands or new things that you were listening to that like helps bring that along? Because it sounds like with this new album, you guys feel like, oh, this is Sainthood Reps. Like this is what the Sainthood Reps sound is.
Yeah, 100%. So obviously, like we played in other bands. Derek started to do his solo project called Gristmill that was very much electronic focused. It was very electronic forward. Think like Alex G or Dijon or McGee or some like artists like that. So we really kind of branched out into more like indie aspects of it. But also what happened, like two things happened. One was like, all right, we realized in this era of social media that engagement, it used to be like the way you stayed engaged with your audience was mainly through touring and mainly through putting out records. And that's not the case anymore. You can stay top of mind and engage with your audience through social media, through creating content. I know it sounds like buzzword galore right now, but it really is kind of how it is. So it's like, wow, like there are ways to stay in touch with your audience and really hone in with your audience in ways that don't require you to be out on the road for 200 days a year. But also we started to notice like, we were a little bit ahead of the game when it comes to like grunge and like incorporating that into emo. And as we kind of like noticed over the last like few years, a lot of the bands that I started to really like, and the rest of the band too, but like, Super Heaven became a massive band, and they were a band that we played with all the time. They were like contemporaries of ours, right? And now all of a sudden they're a TikTok trend, and we see like a whole bunch of bands start to crop up, right? Like there's a band called Glare, Nothing, just this whole like grunge gaze genre, and we're like, holy shit! Like all these bands
Flashwater's
are doing
getting
like
huge right now.
Yeah,
amazing stuff, and I'm like, I wish these bands were around when, like, these are the bands that I wish we could have toured with. These are the bands that have all the same influences. They grew up on at like, or not grew up because they're younger than us, but they love Alice in Chains and they love the early grunge, but they're incorporating that into emo in a way that bands just weren't doing before. And they're also adding like elements of like new metal, and they're adding like shoegaze and stuff. And I'm like, these are like, damn, man, we were like 10 years off with this. Like, if we were just starting out now, we would be like killing it. So, like, in a way, that was inspiring to us. We're seeing a lot of bands, and now before you know it, like, there's like a band called Split Chain that we just played with that are just like they're on Epitaph and they're blowing up, and they're like all these bands that are just really like like the bands that are all wearing like Jenkos now, or they're wearing like
Yeah.
Airwalks again. Like they're really bringing back the Y2K aesthetic. And I'm like, damn, like, so it's hearing like how much that's kind of blown up kind of really made us like, yeah, this is like a really great time to be back in the scene, making music. And the other part is that, we're all from Long Island. And I mentioned before, like growing up, what the scene was like the last few years, the scene, and we're all still pretty much, I know, we all live, adjacent to Long Island. This has been like the best time for Long Island. Like the Long Island scene right now is stronger than it's ever been. And I think we all kind of saw that and we're like, there was just so much inspiration happening around us. We're like, yeah, like let's make more music. Like I want to make more music. I want to play with, Stand Still or Pain of Truth. Like I want to play like, our buddies in like Inner Love, like Movie Life is still doing it, like Bayside's still doing it. So it's like, let's just, like it's just so much inspiration going around, and just taking what they're doing and incorporating that into what we're doing is just super exciting right now.
It's crazy to hear that, Mason. I'm failing to remember what group did we just talk to from Long Island that said the
Johnny
exact
Booth.
same. Yeah,
Johnny
Johnny Booth
yeah.
said the exact same thing as you. He's like, the culture here right now is just insane, and there's so much support behind it. So I believe you 100%.
Yeah, it's a wave, right? Like, and you have to kind of ride that wave, like, because it doesn't happen very often. There was a lull for like over 10 years where, yeah, there's always bands, there's always stuff going on. But like the two biggest bands from Long Island were Incendiary and Backtrack, or at least like in hardcore. And now it's like, all right, there's like huge hardcore bands from Long Island, but now there's Johnny Booth is another example. Like, there's also Iron Chic is still doing it. There's, Inner Love that's like really in the indie side of things too. So there's just, and now they're all playing together too. So it really is harkening back to like what the 90s were like on Long Island, where just all these different bands are like, Koyo is another example of a band that's like, kind of straddling between hardcore, but elements of pop punk. And, so there's just, everyone's just kind of doing so many different things. It's just such an exciting time to be a part of it. And, that's why we're like, yeah, we got to be a part of this, man.
Yeah, I love that. All right. Well, are you ready for your top 5 most influential records?
I am. Let's do it. So,
All right.
this is not in any order, but I am going
That's
to put number 1 is, I'm going to put Pet Sounds from Beach Boys in honor of Brian Wilson. Number 2, and I'll do a quick number 2. Number 2 is Smile from the Beach Boys, the unreleased record that never came out. No, nothing changed my life more than hearing Smile. I used to work at a record store, and when the record store closed down, they let us take home all these different records, like just take whatever you want. So I brought home a Beach Boys box set, and I'm like, cool. I listened to this is like 2005 or whatever. Listen to all these songs, and it was on a CD. I leave the CD running, and I walk away, and I come back, and I just hear what sounds like a freak show carnival, and I'm like, what is this? And they're like demos and stuff that were from the Smile sessions. Like, this is insane. I feel like I'm on an acid trip like this. And I started digging deep into the history of the Beach Boys, and I just fell so in love with Brian Wilson that, I decided I'm buying a piano. I'm getting into harmonies. I am just being intricate with music as much as possible. The way he commanded a studio, I'm like, this is, just completely reshaped how I thought about music. So that's 1 and 2. Number 3, I'm going to say Loveless from My Bloody Valentine.
Mm.
I loved 311 as a kid. Like in high school, 311 was my favorite band, and I was Stay Positive and Love Your Life. I was just a total. I was down. I was all mixed up. I was all the 311 stuff, right? They were my favorite band, and then I put on Loveless, and everything changed. I was like, wait, you can make the first chord of Only Shallow. I'm like, I want to make my guitar sound like this. I'm not a great guitarist. I'm never going to be a great guitarist. I'm never going to be Randy Rhoads. I'm never going to be Eddie Van Halen, but I can make my guitar sound like that. And little did I know that Kevin Shields is a genius, and it's not as simple as doing that. But I was like, all right, that changes everything.
Well, Francesco, thank you so much for chatting more about Sainthood Reps. I'm just really super stoked about the new album. I know it's been quite a few years. It's been over a decade since the last album. So we're just really, really stoked that there's new music in the Sainthood Reps world. And so we're just really excited. Very well could end up being like an album of the year contender in our end of the year list. So we're just really stoked.